When your career ends, a Zen story for finding peace. Right now, a heavy, spinning sensation of vertigo is circulating directly behind your breastbone. A restless and deeply disorienting panic that forms when the structured calendar of your life suddenly becomes entirely empty. You are lying in the dark, yet your muscles are taut with a phantom urge to check an absent task list, your mind frantically searching for a routine that has ceased to exist. It is the silent somatic shock of reached stillness, the terrifying realization that the career, the daily production, and the intense momentum that defined your identity for decades have abruptly stopped. A deep dread of being useless or cast aside settles into your stomach, making you feel as though you are falling through space simply because there is no clock to tell you where to look or what to achieve next. The environment of your room has assumed a different kind of quiet tonight, filled with the thick, earthbound scent of wet river silt and the faint sweet smell of old grain dust that has finally settled into cold stone floors. Outside, the hollow, rhythmic gurgle of a blocked sluice gate reveals that the rushing mountain channel has been diverted elsewhere, leaving the immediate waters to rest in absolute passivity. Inside this space, you are completely released from the obligation to be efficient, functional, or useful to an external engine. Yet, your intellect is likely pacing, treating this unmeasured time as a dangerous void that must be filled with manufactured worries, trying to force your exhausted spirit back into a state of endless motion. Please know, dear friend, that you are not broken, and the profound disorientation you are navigating tonight is not a personal failure or a sign of decay. What you are experiencing is the necessary sacred vertigo that arrives when an engine finally runs out of fuel, a natural pause before the heart remembers how to exist without a quota. Tonight, we will not force your mind to be silent, nor will we demand that you magically feel purposeful to deserve your rest. There is no requirement for you to justify your existence or to map out a new life plan before your body is permitted to sink into the mattress. We are simply inviting that spinning weight behind your breastbone to lose its momentum, trusting the heavy bed to anchor you without any effort of your own. This terrifying sense of purposelessness carries a beautiful and surprising paradox. The very emptiness that makes you feel so discarded is actually the first true glimpse of your unconditioned nature. The mind falsely insists that your worth as a living being is identical to your social output, convincing you that to stop producing is to cease existing entirely. But profound Buddhist insight reveals that your value is an inherent indestructible quality of pure awareness, completely independent of mechanical utility. You do not exist to grind down the world into constant progress. Your presence is a vast, self-sustained sky that is fully complete even when every tool has been laid flat. Non-doing is not the death of meaning, it is the realization that you were always the living water, not just the wheel that turned within it. Right now, if it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool, silt-scented air fill the center of your chest without forcing a specific pattern or a rhythmic depth. There is absolutely no need to solve your whole life tonight, and nothing is required of you except to notice how exhausting it has been to run for so long without a rest. Maybe you have felt this too, this strange, ghost-like sensation of walking through an empty house with nowhere you are expected to be, but you are safe enough to soften the rigid brace across your ribs right now. You do not have to earn your right to rest by completing one final task, nor do you need to figure out how to navigate tomorrow before your eyes are allowed to close. The night has no deadlines for you to meet. Imagine a heavy wooden water wheel whose massive oak axle has been completely uncoupled from the village grinding stones, left to sit quietly in the smooth tail race of an old mill pond. For decades, this great wheel turned without interruption, its thick paddles lifted and dropped by a rushing current, forced to bear the crushing weight of the granite stones that turned corn into dust. But tonight, the main channel has been closed, and the wheel no longer drives the gears or satisfies the hunger of the valley. It simply floats listlessly in the dark, transparent water, its wet timber absorbing the coolness of the evening. The wheel does not cry out for more grain to crush, nor does it view its immobility as a defect. It simply allows the river to pass through its slats without resistance. This is exactly how your nervous system becomes paralyzed when you treat your retirement, or ceased routine as an act of personal erasure, viewing a blank calendar as a threat rather than a return to your original space. The hollow panic in your chest is not an indicator that your life has ended. It is merely the sign that your awareness is being uncoupled from an artificial system of measurement, allowed to return to its unforced nature. Finding peace within this space requires no frantic effort to look busy, no forced creation of hobbies, and no intellectual defense in a moment. We will explore this profound transition through the story of a master temple administrator who found himself completely relieved of his duties, learning that an empty vessel does not lose its nature just because it has stopped measuring out a man's labor. Let your body sink completely into the dark as we travel to a silent watermill, where the damp timber rests in the quiet stream. Deep within the damp, cedar-shadowed valley where the mountain springs collected into a single, rushing mill race, a master temple administrator named Joshin lived in a state of sudden, silent paralysis. For 40 years, his entire existence had been defined by the absolute precision of his movements, managing the sprawling temple grounds, regulating the winter provisions, and supervising the great communal grain mill that fed hundreds of monks along the ridge. He had been the clock of the valley, a man whose identity was entirely fused with the relentless, productive hum of the wooden gears. Yet 3 days ago, because his hands had begun to tremble with advanced age, the High Abbot had gently relieved him of all administrative titles, appointing a younger monk to take his place at the ledger desk. Suddenly, the complex network of duties that had held Joshin upright for a lifetime vanished, leaving him standing in an empty courtyard with absolutely nowhere he was expected to go. The physical focus of Joshin's deep internal vertigo tonight was an ancient, unlined copper water-dropping vessel, known as a sukyu, which he had carried at his belt for nearly half a century. This small, heavy flask was historically used by temple timekeepers to measure out exact work intervals. It had a microscopic, pin-sized hole at its base and a narrow neck that allowed water to escape in a rhythmic, unvarying succession of single drops. For decades, Joshin had lived by the cold discipline of that metallic drip, using its steady subtraction to schedule the cutting of timber, the grinding of barley, and the precise moment the heavy wooden sluice gates were to be lifted. But tonight, as he sat alone in a drafty, abandoned corner of the watermill house, the copper vessel sat completely empty on the unpolished cedar bench beside him, its interior dry, its seams crusted with a thick, pale film of green verdigris. Instead of finding relief in his retirement, Joshin interpreted this profound cessation of labor as a terrifying form of personal erasure, an indicator that his life had been stripped of its underlying validity. Lying flat upon a thin straw mat on the floorboards, his upper shoulders were locked in a rigid, defensive scaffolding, his chest tight with a phantom necessity to hear the clack of the waterwheel gears. Every time the wind rustled the dried reed thatch above his head, his hand would instinctively twitch toward his belt, searching for the heavy weight of a schedule that was no longer his to keep. He felt completely like a ghost in his own body, replaying 40 years of administrative decisions in his mind, his intellect frantically trying to manufacture new tasks to ward off the crushing sensation of being utterly discarded. When the midnight dampness began to rise from the mill pond, making the wet oak timbers of the floorboards creak with the drop in temperature, Joshin found the static in his forehead completely unendurable. He lifted the empty, verdigris-crusted copper vessel from the bench and walked out into the misty courtyard, following a slippery, moss-covered stone path that led toward a small, drafty storage hut at the far edge of the temple gardens. There lived an old maintenance monk named Master Soin, a man who held no official titles, kept no hours, and spent his days in absolute quiet, seemingly occupied with nothing but listening to the natural expansion and contraction of the ancient temple wood. The atmosphere inside Soin's small hut was entirely devoid of administrative order, smelling faintly of wet earth, dried moss, and the cold ink of long-forgotten letters. No water clocks or sundials decorated the walls. The only illumination came from a single low-burning tallow lamp that cast a soft amber glow over the unhewn stone hearth. When Joshin stepped across the threshold, his throat tight with the weight of his uselessness, he set the empty copper sukyu onto the low table between them, confessing that his purpose had been cut off, that his days had become an empty void, and that without the turning of the wheel, his existence felt entirely hollowed out. Soin did not offer a complicated sermon on the nature of detachment, nor did he instruct Joshin to be grateful for his newfound freedom. He moved with an absolute, unhurried deliberation that seemed to match the quiet resting of the mountain itself. He reached out his wrinkled hand, picked up the verdigris-crusted vessel, and turned it over to look at the tiny, dry hole at its base. Without a single word of explanation, the old monk did not attempt to pour water into the neck, nor did he clean the green corrosion from the seams instead. He simply laid the copper flask completely on its side upon the bare wood, allowing it to rest motionless in the dim light of the lamp. The old master pointed to a small gap in the floorboards, where the dark water of the natural mountain spring could be seen moving silently beneath the hut, completely unchanneled by any wooden flume or sluice gate. He looked directly into Joshin's wide, anxious eyes and spoke in a low, grounding whisper that seemed to echo behind the young monk's breastbone. "Why do you scold the vessel for being empty, when it is only in the complete ending of the drip that the copper finally remembers it is allowed to simply hold the stillness of the room?" Joshin looked down at the motionless flask resting on its side, the green verdigris showing dull in the shadow, and a sudden, profound wave of emotional recognition washed through his rigid torso. He realized that his internal panic was not a sign of his decay, but the natural uncoupling of his soul from an artificial machine of measurement. The heavy tension behind his ribs gave way completely, leaving him sitting on the damp floorboards, no longer needing to turn a wheel to be anchored in the deep night. The dry, silent stillness of that empty copper sukyu, resting on its side in a dark storage hut, is not an invitation to completely deaden your human heart, nor is it a cold command to turn yourself into an unfeeling block of stone that feels no grief for the ending of a long career. This ancient administrator's journey is pointing towards something infinitely quieter, illuminating the precise way we turn our ceased momentum into an accusation against our own existence, and how we can find peace when our structural world comes to a sudden halt. The spinning, hollow vertigo you feel behind your breastbone tonight is not an indicator that your life has lost its fundamental value. It is simply the natural emotional manifestation of trying to force a quieted, uncoupled spirit back into a tight system of production that it has already naturally completed. We spend an immense amount of our nightly vitality attempting to maintain the internal vibration of a frantic routine, completely forgetting that some vessels are meant to stop dripping before they can hold a deeper stillness. True Buddhist wisdom, when translated into the immediate language of your private disorientation, helps us see that our deepest exhaustion does not emerge from the simple reality that an old job has ended, a schedule has dissolved, or a position of authority has been handed to another. Those shifts are simply the fluid, unyielding movement of impermanence itself, as natural as the natural mountain springs moving silently beneath the floorboards in the midnight frost. The true suffering was not only in what happened, not only in the reality of the empty calendar, but in the desperate, agonizing way the mind held what happened, treating the natural arrival of rest as a terrifying proof of absolute worthlessness. We falsely believe that if we can just clamp our jaws tighter and continue to manufacture artificial worries, we can somehow maintain our place inside an engine that no longer requires our movement. When you spend your Latin night hours replaying old professional decisions, checking your mind for a sign of an absent responsibility, or feeling an acute sense of shame because your days are no longer marked by a visible achievement, you are independently adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the quiet, clean weight of transition, the reality that a long-held routine has run its course, leaving you temporarily standing in an empty courtyard without an immediate purpose. The second wound is what your own intellect manufactures when it takes that natural emptiness and labels it as a state of uselessness, scolding your spirit for its immobility and assuming you must be fundamentally broken because you are no longer turning the grinding stones. You take the empty flask of your past utility and shake it repeatedly in the dark, bruising your own heart to recreate a rhythm that your life has already outgrown. True awareness begins the exact moment you pause that frantic, circular effort to look efficient, and allow the unmeasured hours of your day to exist without an immediate requirement to justify them. Wisdom is acting like the old maintenance monk who does not attempt to force water back into a dry neck, but instead recognizes that the complete ending of the drip is the very prerequisite for allowing the metal to absorb the calm of the room. It is the realization that your fundamental validity as a living presence is not dependent on staying locked within a permanent machine of utility, nor does it require you to continuously produce results to earn your space on this earth. The moment you stop treating your ceased motion as an act of personal failure, the spinning vertigo behind your breastbone naturally begins to yield its density to the dark. This quiet path shifts your relationship with stillness entirely, transforming a cold somatic panic into a profound self-compassionate ripening. Compassion is the soft, protective understanding that allows your life to feel temporarily empty and unanchored without assuming that your core self has been discarded or ruined by the absence of a task. The old master did not demand that Joshin repair his copper tool or pretend the green verdigris had not altered its function. He simply showed him that true stability is found by stepping out of the collective workshop and trusting the unchanneled water moving beneath the floor. You do not need to build a brand new professional identity or find an immediate new responsibility to be whole. Tonight, you can simply allow the old schedules to fall away into the dark, letting your chest expand within the deep, unmeasured freedom of the evening. If it feels right to you at this moment, let your awareness gently drift away from the heavy narrative of what you used to produce and settle entirely within the immediate, physical environment of your resting body. There is absolutely no need to force a sudden state of absolute stillness, or to approach this quiet moment as if it were a test that you must pass before you are allowed to sleep. You are simply a tired living presence allowing your shoulders to yield to the surface beneath you, permitting the bed to assume the entire responsibility of holding your weight. Perhaps you might begin by tuning into the slow, organic movement of your breath, simply observing the slight, cool touch of air at the back of your throat and the quiet, heavy release that follows each unhurried cycle. As you breathe out, you might invite the heavy, spinning vertigo behind your breastbone to soften its structural grip, even just a tiny fraction of an inch. There is no need to aggressively strip away the disorientation or to scold your heart for feeling unanchored, for even the simple act of noticing the hollow space is completely enough to begin a gentle decompression. If you feel a restless momentum in your thoughts, a persistent urge to fix the schedule that has dissolved, or to figure out what you will accomplish next, do not try to suppress that impulse. Just let that frantic pacing exist within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention, recognizing that this static is merely the place where your nervous system has been storing the accumulated tension of trying to turn an uncoupled wheel. Perhaps, as you rest in this dim space, a very specific memory of an old professional title, an unvoiced expectation, or a recent moment of empty time will drift into the center of your mind. When it arrives, there is no need to follow it down into the dark, familiar loops of overthinking, and you do not have to fight it to prove your spiritual strength. Just let the thought be seen for what it is, imagining it as a single, dry drop of water failing to form at the base of that unlined copper suicune, resting flat on its side upon a dark cedar bench. You might give this recurring emotional pattern a soft internal name, saying to yourself, "This is the old habit of measuring out my labor," or "This is the fear of being left behind by the machine." By naming the pattern without judgment, you are gently creating a soft, protective distance between the awareness that observes and the outdated professional identity that is passing away. Imagine now that the rigid, external schedules and past timestamps you have been carrying for years are beginning to lose their grip on your identity. If it feels right, you might visualize these old lists and daily expectations gently evaporating like morning dew off a cold, unpolished slate tile, leaving the slate damp, dark, and perfectly blank underneath. There is no need to force these fragments to detach at a specific speed. You can simply watch them drift downward through the dark space of your inner landscape, getting lighter and quieter with every passing breath. Feel the subtle, shifting relief as the pressure pulls away from the center of your chest, leaving your upper body feeling remarkably empty, porous, and entirely free from the requirement to maintain a permanent ledger of utility. With your next long, effortless exhalation, you can choose to place the specific burden of your purposelessness directly onto that heavy wooden water wheel we encountered earlier, sitting quietly in the smooth tail race of the old mill pond. Picture the vast, dark waters stretching out under the night sky, and let the imagery change in its own time as you watch the main sluice gate block the rushing current completely. You do not need to do any of the active work of grinding grain or driving the gears. You can simply watch the slow, rhythmic whisper of the unchanneled water pass through the wooden slats, leaving the wheel to float listlessly in the dark. Sense the deep relief that arrives when you stop trying to push against the riverbed, letting go of the entire project of output and leaving your spirit to rest in its own motionless center. There is no promise that your sense of disorientation will completely dissolve into the air tonight, and there is no requirement to experience a sudden, dramatic breakthrough of emotional healing before you are allowed to close your eyes. The intention behind this gentle inner practice is simply to help you inhabit your own skeleton with a little less friction, showing your nervous system that it is entirely safe to step down from the stage of your old utility for the next few hours. You can return to this soft, downward letting go whenever you notice your mind being pulled back into the cold workshops of administrative obligation. Or you can simply let the visualization fade completely from your thoughts, returning your focus to the simple, physical reality of the cool, silt-scented air expanding your rib cage. Your life does not belong to a fixed, unyielding machine, and your value as a living presence is not dependent on your ability to force yourself back into a routine that has become too narrow for your spirit. As the heavy weights of expectation are set down onto the stone, the space that opens up behind your breastbone is not a terrifying void, but a soft, luminous freedom that has never forgotten how to exist for itself. Let your arms and legs grow increasingly heavy, as if you are sinking into a deep bed of damp river silt that grows completely undisturbed by the deadlines written in old books. But there is still a deeper transformation waiting to reveal itself, a shift that moves from the softening of the vessel to the complete acceptance of absolute immobility. Now let this high mountain wisdom come slightly closer to your contemporary heart as we prepare to look at a second, deeper journey that took place within an old stone quarry where the wild mint grows. 2 full moons after the copper flask had been left, resting silently on its side, Joshin walked far beyond the familiar boundary lines of the Temple Valley, climbing toward the high, windswept ridges where the granite was quarried. Despite the profound relief he had discovered during his winter in the maintenance hut, a subtle, lingering friction still nested directly behind his throat, a persistent, hidden anxiety that without a visible, structured position to anchor his mornings. He was merely an empty ghost drifting through an unmeasured void. He was carrying a small sack of parched beans and a single threadbare blanket, intending to reach the old northern paths where the great blocks of stone were shaped. He hoped to find a new place where his administrative precision might find an external purpose, terrified that if he remained completely motionless, his spirit would simply atrophy into absolute nothingness. The physical focus of Joshin's deep uncertainty on this journey was a massive, cracked granite grinding stone, known as an yusu, which had been rolled off its iron spindle generations ago and left to lie flat in the high, overgrown weeds behind an abandoned mountain granary. This ancient stone was 4 spans wide, its rough circular face carved with deep, radiating grooved ridges that had once been used to crush grain into fine flour. But through some ancient structural flaw, a deep hairline fracture had split the granite from its center out to the rim, rendering it entirely useless for the heavy labor of the mill. As Joshin sat on the damp earth beside it, the dry mountain weeds scraping against the rough granite in the evening breeze, he felt a strange, lopsided weight in his chest. His intellect began to parse through 40 years of temple ledgers, frantically trying to figure out if there was a way to bind the stone together, as if fixing this discarded block could somehow restore his own shattered sense of utility. The high quarry was shrouded in a thick, uniform layer of mountain mist that smelled faintly of wild mint, cold flint, and the damp earth of the upper tiers. There were no clear boundaries to follow in this elevated space. The paths had dissolved into a formless, gray shadow, and the only indicator of reality was the low, continuous whisper of the wind passing through the fractures in the rock. As the twilight deepened, making the damp fog cling to his robe, Joshin felt a massive wave of internal resistance rising behind his breastbone. His mind began to aggressively manufacture a series of terrifying future scenarios, convincing him that if he did not find a new project or a new system to organize, his existence would become entirely invisible and erased. He was treating his own frantic, catastrophic thoughts as an absolute truth, gripping the edges of his thin blanket so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white in the mountain chill. Washed over by an unmapped drift of mist near the edge of the pit, Joshin encountered an old master stonemason named Okuro, who had long since lost his physical sight and spent his days sitting on an unhewn boulder, simply feeling the moisture of the wind. Okuro did not offer him a set of instructions to help him rebuild his routine, nor did he encourage him to find a new career among the lower towns. Moving with a slow, grounded deliberation that seemed to match the ancient weight of the mountain itself, the blind builder reached into his rough canvas vest and pulled out a small, unsharpened iron wedge that he used to test the grain of the rock, its blunt face cold and unpolished in his calloused palm. Without uttering a single phrase of evaluation, the old stonemason reached out his hand and gently placed the iron wedge directly into the deepest part of the crack within the granite grinding stone, not trying to force the fissure open or bind the stone together, but simply letting the iron rest loosely inside the fracture to emphasize the reality of the split. He turned his face toward Joshin's anxious silhouette, his sightless eyes completely untroubled by the dense fog wrapping around the quarry walls, and spoke in a low, gravelly whisper that cut straight through the young monk's intellectual panic. "Why do you break your heart trying to force a cracked stone back onto an iron spindle, when the fracture itself is simply the granite telling you it is finally allowed to stop grinding the world into dust?" Joshin felt a sudden, sharp contraction behind his sternum, his intellect spinning with the urge to argue that without a firm place inside a working engine, a stone was merely a useless piece of rubble left to be buried by the weeds. But as he looked at the blind mason, who sat on the unhewn boulder without a single ledger or schedule, completely unbothered by the absolute lack of production, he caught himself mid-phrase. He took a long, slow, horizontal breath of the mint-scented fog, making a conscious, deliberate choice to pause the habit of treating his own terrifying thoughts as an absolute reality. Instead of trying to pull the iron wedge out or plan a way to repair the granite, he relaxed his fingers, letting go of the blanket and allowing his hands to rest flat upon the cold, rough surface of the cracked stone. He chose to simply sit with the profound uncertainty of his unmeasured life. The transformation did not magically clear the mist from the high quarry, nor did it provide him with a new administrative title to secure his future. It changed the entire way Joshin related to the emptiness behind his breastbone. As he sat quietly in the damp grass beside the broken grinding stone, entirely uncoupled from any network of efficiency and devoid of external alignment, he realized that his long-cherished professional identities were exactly like that cracked granite tools that had simply completed their labor and were now being invited to return to their original nature. He stopped the lifelong habit of trying to turn an absent spindle, choosing instead to sit with the absolute immobility of the rock. A profound wave of self-forgiveness washed through his skeleton, leaving him resting in the middle of the overgrown weeds, no longer needing to grind down the hours to know that his presence was entirely whole. This silent integration amidst the high, mist-shrouded quarry of the ridge lays bare the exact psychological grid that keeps your own thoughts spinning in a state of high nocturnal vigilance tonight. When you observe that cracked granite grinding stone resting flat in the high, overgrown weeds, completely uncoupled from its iron spindle, you are looking directly at the anatomy of your own professional exhaustion. The great delusion of our contemporary survival is the belief that to be safe, valid, and structurally stable, We must continuously force our life path to rotate around a machine of endless output. We treat the natural endings of our careers, the loss of our daily routines, and the shifting of our internal capacity not as a normal part of our earthly evolution, but as a terrifying proof of personal erasure, turning the simple reality of our rest into an existential crisis. The emotional engine that drives this late-night paralysis is a frantic, unconscious craving to control an inherently changing and impermanent reality. When you lie awake in your room, your intellect spends its vital energy aggressively rehearsing future scenarios where you might look purposeless, or replaying past achievements to figure out exactly when your momentum began to decline. You take the high standards of an idealized utility and turn them into a tool of deep self-judgment, scolding your heart for its quietness and trying to fix your uncoupled identity through a sense of structural shame. This constant effort to force yourself back onto a turning axle creates a profound, agonizing split in your awareness, causing you to turn the pain of ceased motion into a permanent personal identity, as if you are a broken tool left to be buried by the dark. By illuminating this mechanical process, the relationship you hold with your own internal emptiness begins to undergo a profound, comforting transformation. Buddhist wisdom cuts through all academic complexity by dividing our emotional experience into two distinct dimensions: the initial pain that life naturally brings to our doorstep, and the secondary suffering that our own mind independently adds through its fierce resistance to reality. The first pain consists of the raw, unpolished conditions of your changing life, the physical reality that a long career has ended, the natural grief that arises when you no longer have an external office to anchor your mornings, and the quiet weight of navigating a major transition without an immediate purpose. These are the elements that you cannot always control, anticipate, or prevent, as they are part of the changing seasons of a developing soul. The second pain, however, is the heavy, spinning vertigo that solidifies directly behind your breastbone, when your intellect refuses to let that initial emptiness simply exist without an aggressive interrogation. The second pain is what happens when you treat a single restless thought as an absolute truth that must be solved before dawn, or when you use the very concepts of healing to scold your heart for feeling unanchored in a world that has no permanent schedules. When you spend your midnight hours trying to force an uncoupled waterwheel back into a rushing channel, you are actively feeding the second pain with your own hypervigilant attention, mistaking the natural arrival of rest for a personal defect. You are trying to grind down the hours into constant progress out of a heart that was always meant to return to its original, uncarved nature. True peace, when encountered in the deep space of the late hours, is never the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a sterile state of existence where no sad thoughts ever cross the threshold of your mind. Peace is found by establishing a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives, learning to sit comfortably within the fog of your own transition without needing to force an immediate new responsibility. You do not have to force your internal noise to become perfectly silent to deserve your rest tonight, and you do not need to anchor your life to a new project before your body is permitted to settle into the dark. The moment you pause the frantic, performative effort to look entirely efficient, the rigid scaffolding across your upper shoulders naturally relinquishes its density, allowing your attention to pool deeply in the center of your resting frame. You discover that your true luminous presence is like that heavy wooden water wheel, inherently whole, completely resilient, and entirely capable of floating listlessly in the dark tail race, precisely because it possesses the capacity to let the rushing mountain current pass through its slats without resistance. The deep, unchanneled stream of your awareness is moving safely beneath the performative static at this very moment, completely uncompromised by the high expectations you have placed upon your chest, waiting only for you to pull your hands inside the perimeter of the raft and trust the deep water to hold you up. This high quarry wisdom, pulled from uncoupled granite and the silent expansion of cold floorboards, is not a collection of beautiful concepts meant to be stored away in a quiet corner of your intellect, existing only while you listen to a steady voice in the darkness. It is a soft, practical cadence designed to be carried directly into the noisy, unpolished friction of your contemporary afternoon. True inner peace is never an elusive, monumental milestone that you master by permanently fixing your entire structural history. At once it is practiced and reclaimed in the smallest, most ordinary pauses of your daily survival. It is found in that brief, hidden space that opens up between an empty hour that triggers your fear of obsolescence, and the sudden, reactive contraction that tightens behind your breastbone before you reach for your device to manufacture a new task. Think of how frequently the old habit of using a forced, artificial efficiency to hide your internal sense of purposelessness returns to your side during a standard week, masquerading as the frantic urge to organize your surroundings when you are feeling entirely unencored, or the exhausting effort of smiling brightly at a meeting, while your inner landscape feels completely heavy, detached, and cold inside. You might notice this rigid armor locking into place when you are lying awake at night, replaying a minor professional mistake or comparing your own uncoupled progress with the seemingly immaculate, high-speed trajectories of people you see online. The mind quickly treats these moments of transition as a catastrophic personal deficiency, causing you to feel profoundly behind in life, as if you are a flawed engine that has failed to maintain the collective rotation. We live in an accelerated environment that continuously pushes us to present an unyielding, perfectly optimized exterior to the world, leaving many of us feeling deeply lonely and hidden beneath the weight of our own historical velocity. Out of a fear of uncertainty, you might try to overanalyze a changing relationship or fear a future financial transition, using the very concepts of self-care to judge your own natural fatigue. You treat your own changing capacity as a malfunctioning water clock that must be aggressively forced back into the traditional rhythm, convincing yourself that you must earn your right to absolute rest by first achieving a spotless state of external utility that leaves no room for raw, unpolished human transitions. But Buddhist insight gently invites you to step down from the stage of your old utility tomorrow, showing you that a single breath before answering a demanding message is a profound form of living wisdom that requires no professional credentials. You do not need to reshape your entire daily routine into a permanent engine of output to be worthy of your space on this earth, and you can care deeply about the projects in your life without gripping their validation so tightly that your own nervous system remains in a state of constant, defensive tension. Not every hypervigilant thought that crosses your mind deserves your absolute obedience, and not every floating feeling of uselessness is an unshakable command that must be solved before the sun breaks through the window. You can rest without earning it first, letting go of the performative need to appear functional and allowing your unhewn stone to simply touch the ground. The next time you find yourself wanting rest but feeling an acute wave of guilt for resting, remember that the vastness of your true presence carries an innate capacity to hold both your longing for meaning and your need for complete immobility together in the same wide channel, without requiring a flawless performance. This practical shift in your daily habit does not mean the complex realities of your modern schedule will suddenly lose their weight. It means you become a far more porous, resilient, and unbothered presence within your own skin, because your fundamental safety is no longer dependent on keeping your internal air vents blocked by an excess of structural panic. You are entirely permitted to let the world move on without your perfect supervision for the next few hours, letting go of the gears of your analytical thoughts and allowing your physical frame to sink into the heavy gravity of the evening. Let this realization soften the remaining scaffolding behind your breastbone as the room around you grows increasingly cool, preparing your awareness to dissolve completely into the unlit source of the dark night. The damp mountain fog that swirled across the high stone quarry all evening has finally grown completely still, leaving the dark, unpolished timber of your room untouched by the slightest trace of friction. The heavy, spinning vertigo that was anchoring itself directly behind your breastbone has lost its last remaining density, leaving nothing but a vast, porous emptiness where the old weight of structural schedules used to rest. Your body feels immensely heavy against the linen, sinking steadily into the unyielding foundation of the mattress, as if your entire skeleton is finally relinquishing its long, performative vigil against the possibility of being useless. You do not need to maintain the illusion of an unchanging routine. For the remainder of this night, you are entirely permitted to let the heavy, tensed scaffolding of your past utility collapse into the quiet dark. Let your breathing become an absolute whisper, a shallow and completely effortless tide that requires no tracking, no verification, and no intellectual intervention from your tired heart. The heavy wooden water wheel that turned without interruption for decades is sitting in perfect immobility upon its quiet mill pond, its thick oak paddles completely submerged in the dark, transparent water. The frantic urge to drive the grinding gears has dissolved into the cool evening air, leaving the wheel to float listlessly beneath the silent night sky, entirely unbothered by the wide, empty space of the channel stretching out into the dark. The internal space behind your breastbone is completely unmeasured, completely uncoupled, and entirely free from the requirement to hold a traditional schedule for the world outside. You can stop trying to force the waterlogged bamboo pole into the shifting riverbed tonight. The ancient cracked granite grinding stone has been left flat in the high, overgrown weeds behind the abandoned granary, and there are no narrow, suffocating grids left to crush, no traditional expectations to satisfy, and no administrative decisions to repair with the frantic labor of your intellect. The evening sluice gate has dropped completely into the mud, cutting off the rushing current and leaving the immediate waters to settle into absolute, unresisting passivity. You do not have to bridge the gap between who you were and what you will accomplish next before your eyes can close, because the true luminous depth of your awareness has never once been broken by the endings of your routine. Sink down deeper into the stillness, letting the tiny muscles around your eyes go entirely slack, letting the weight of your limbs dissolve into the mattress like old grain dust softening beneath a single splash of cool mountain water. The wild mint along the quarry flats is resting in the midnight fog, spreading its loose, fragrant leaves toward the darkness, without a single thought of order, completely content to exist exactly where the earth dictates. You are returning home to an undivided baseline of presence that existed long before you ever learned to measure your worth by your social output, or turn a temporary transition into an absolute proof of decay. This spacious ground is your original sanctuary, a timeless expanse that asks for no permanent ledgers of efficiency, requires no immaculate displays of functioning, and demands no fixed anchors to grant you rest. Allow yourself to slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, letting your name, your history, and your professional fatigue dissolve like fine silt washing clean from the iron spindle of an old grinding stone. The low, continuous clack of the wooden water wheel gears has completely died away, leaving only the soft, cooling whisper of the unchanneled spring to soothe the rough knots of your being. You have full permission to leave your entire life journey completely unmanaged and uncorrected until the sun climbs over the eastern ridge, trusting the heavy, uncarved structure of your body to hold its own presence without your supervision. Let your mind go entirely dark, letting your soul drift down into the boundless, unlit quiet where you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. When the heavy wheel of what you used to do is finally uncoupled from the axle, who is it that is left resting in the quiet water? It is the unconditioned, silent presence that was always there, waiting behind the curtain of your effort, entirely complete, long before you ever attempted to craft a useful or productive reputation. The analytical mind spent its daylight hours operating under the deep delusion that it was solely responsible for holding your life upright, acting like a frantic engineer, trying to keep an uncoupled wheel spinning to keep the sky from falling. But when you abandon the project of continuous utility and sink completely into the dark space of this room, you begin to see that the awareness holding your breath is like the deep space of the valley itself. It does not lose its fundamental vastness just because a cloud of raw, unpolished human disorientation passes through its contours. Nor does it require a perfectly turning axle to find its ultimate purpose. The performative pressures and hidden doubts that tightened behind your breastbone today were merely temporary ripples on the surface of a deep well that remains completely still, cool, and undisturbed in its quietest depths. When you allow the frantic necessity of continuous checking and structural optimization to drop away into the shadows, you are not failing your discipline. You are finally offering your heart the only true compassion it can ever receive. A mind that is locked in a state of high structural hypervigilance can only repeat the rigid, exhausting loops of the past, using the same old weights of shame to force a wild, living nature into an artificial mold. By choosing to step down from the stage of your own achievement for the remainder of this night, you are allowing the dry slate of your mind to touch the damp earth of your real feelings, letting the defensive edges soften naturally at their own biological pace. You are discovering that you do not need to tarnish your relationship with the present moment to prove your devotion to a productive ideal, because your fundamental validity as a living presence is already completely independent of any ledger written before your birth. Let your exhalations become even longer, softer, and more thoroughly unhurried, a quiet biological tide that fills your bedding with a sense of absolute safety and unbothered comfort. The lingering gray static that was vibrating across your forehead has lost its fuel completely, drying up like a patch of wet clay under the gentle warmth of an evening fire, leaving your temples feeling cool, wide, and entirely spacious. You do not have to prove that you are an exceptionally efficient or grounded worker to deserve the comfort of this stillness, and you do not need to figure out a perfect formula for your upcoming responsibilities before your brain is permitted to drop its guard. The dark night accepts you exactly as you are, in this moment, unpolished, tired, and beautifully incomplete, asking for nothing but your willingness to stop the labor of management and trust the natural gravity of your body to carry you down into the dark. Feel the immense, stabilizing weight that settles into your limbs as you release the very last illusion that your life is an intricate network of intellectual ledgers that must be continuously mended, propped up, or balanced to prevent a structural failure. The cool night air that circulates around your room tonight does not keep a record of your perceived inadequacies, the professional concepts you struggled to embody, or the moments where you felt too heavy inside to maintain a cheerful exterior for those around you. The darkness is an ancient, non-judgmental sanctuary that wraps its arms completely around your exhaustion, offering you a timeless shelter where your name, your history, and your cognitive fatigue can all be gently laid down like an unpolished iron vessel left on a cold stone floor. You are entirely permitted to let the world move on without your perfect supervision for the next few hours, letting go of the need to fix your mind and allowing your physical frame to merge completely with the deep, supportive ground below. The remaining echoes of your daily overstimulation are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the sound of dry pine logs cracking in a hillside kiln miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp boundaries and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every memory is softly forgotten, every heavy vine is lifted, and your spirit is finally, beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. This perfect peace is not a temporary prize you must guard with anxious effort, but the ever-present, unmoving foundation of your awareness. When the artificial necessity of performance has been completely surrendered, the intellect often struggles to accept this effortless baseline, operating under the subtle delusion that if it stops its fierce vigilance for even a single evening, the entire structure of your identity will dissolve into meaningless chaos. It convinces you that you must continually maintain a rigid posture, sorting through your history, analyzing your modern routines, and checking your progress against the world to ensure you are not left behind. But when you rest quietly in the deep, unmeasured space of this room, you begin to see that the vast sky of your presence does not lose its fundamental reality just because an old, familiar framework of routine has run its course. The fog does not rewrite the landscape, nor does it diminish the ancient, silent mountain Beneath the grass, it is simply a passing seasonal condition, a temporary clearing of the air that allows your spirit to finally remember its uncarved nature. Your true, indestructible value is like that massive granite grinding stone resting flat in the high weeds, entirely whole and unbroken, even when it is no longer turned by the gears of the valley mill. The standards you failed to meet, the unspoken expectations you felt guilty for questioning, and the deep, somatic fatigue of always pretending to be fully integrated were merely passing shadows on a reservoir that remains completely still, dark and undisturbed in its quietest chambers. The long decades you spent trying to secure a perfect reflection inside the tarnish-streaked mirror of public utility have not diminished your inner sanctuary by a single fraction, because the open space that holds your breath has no parameters that can be frayed by history, and no boundaries that can be broken by an excess of structural pressure. When you allow the frantic necessity of continuous self-optimization to drop away into the darkness, you are not abandoning your purpose, you are finally offering your heart the only true healing it can ever receive. A mind that is locked in a state of high structural tension can only repeat the rigid defensive patterns of its past, using the same old weights of shame to force a vibrant, living presence into an artificial mold. By choosing to step out of that hyper-vigilant loop for the remainder of this night, you are allowing the unrefined clay of your life to soak in the gentle moisture of an unconditional acceptance, letting the defensive edges of your identity soften naturally at their own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to compromise your relationship with the present moment to pay an ancient debt of belonging, because your fundamental value as a living presence is already completely independent of any ledger written before your birth. Let your exhalations become even longer, softer, and more thoroughly unhurried, a quiet biological tide that fills your bedding with a sense of absolute safety and unbothered comfort. The remaining gray static that was vibrating across your forehead has lost its fuel completely, drying up like a patch of wet clay under the gentle warmth of an evening fire, leaving your temples feeling cool, wide, and entirely spacious. You do not have to prove that you are an exceptionally mindful or grounded person to deserve the comfort of this stillness. And you do not need to figure out a perfect formula for your upcoming responsibilities before your brain is permitted to drop its guard. The dark night accepts you exactly as you are in this moment, unpolished, tired, and beautifully incomplete, asking for nothing but your willingness to stop the labor of management and trust the natural structure of your body to carry you down into the dark. Feel the immense, stabilizing weight that settles into your limbs as you release the very last illusion that your life is an intricate network of intellectual ledgers that must be continuously mended, propped up, or balanced to prevent a structural failure. The cool night air that circulates around your room tonight does not keep a record of your perceived inadequacies, the relationships you struggled to maintain, or the moments where you felt too heavy inside to share the collective rhythm. The darkness is an ancient, non-judgmental sanctuary that wraps its arms completely around your exhaustion, offering you a timeless shelter where your name, your history, and your cognitive fatigue can all be gently laid down like an unpolished iron vessel left on a cold stone floor. You are entirely permitted to let the world move on without your perfect supervision for the next few hours, letting go of the need to fix your mind and allowing your physical frame to merge completely with the deep, supportive ground below. The remaining echoes of your daily overstimulation are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the sound of dry pine logs cracking in a hillside kiln miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp boundaries and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every memory is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. This unmoving peace is not a distant shoreline that you must struggle to reach through a final act of sheer mental determination, but the vast, self-contained ocean that has always been holding your life, even when you were too busy driving the wooden gears to notice its depth. The analytical mind spent decades operating under the persistent illusion that it was the sole creator of your meaning, believing that if it ever allowed the momentum of your daily production to drop to zero, your entire existence would simply collapse into a state of permanent obscurity. It taught you to treat the natural arrival of your resting years not as a sacred return to your original freedom, but as a dangerous void that had to be frantically guarded, checked, and filled with a series of manufactured concerns. But when you rest flat upon this surface, completely uncoupled from the network of historical expectations, you begin to see that your fundamental identity has never been identical to the tasks you performed. The sky does not apologize to the valley for being empty of clouds, nor does a quiet mountain stream require a permission slip from the village to flow silently through the dark woods. Your true, unconditioned nature is like that heavy copper vessel resting completely on its side, entirely whole, beautiful, and self-sustained precisely because it has stopped measuring out the precious hours of a man's labor, the professional titles you left behind, the daily validation you felt disoriented without, and the deep, somatic panic of walking through an unmeasured schedule. We're merely passing weather systems on a bedrock that remains completely unmoved, deep, and beautifully silent in its most sacred core. The decades you spent pouring your vital energy into a machine of collective utility have not depleted your inner sanctuary by a single drop, because the pure awareness that observes your breath has no quota that must be satisfied, and no deadlines that can be broken by the simple arrival of your exhaustion. When you allow the frantic habit of constant self-evaluation to fade into the dim light of the room, you are not losing your place in the world. You are finally allowing your spirit to return to the only true home it has ever known. A heart that is trapped in a state of continuous structural vigilance can only view a blank calendar as a threat to its survival, using the old mechanisms of shame to force a tired, changing life back into an outdated routine. By making the conscious, deliberate choice to step down from the stage of your old identity for the remainder of this night, you are permitting your nervous system to fully absorb the cool, stabilizing moisture of the evening, letting the rigid boundaries of your past titles soften naturally at their own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to justify your existence to the darkness to deserve the comfort of this bed, because your value as a living presence was already fully complete long before you ever learned to score your days as a success or a failure. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that requires no intervention from your intellect, simply expanding and releasing within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention. The lingering tightness that was vibrating across your upper chest has completely lost its hold, dissolving like a handful of dry grain dust, settling into the cold stone floor of an empty mill house, leaving your ribs feeling remarkably light, porous, and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future mornings before your eyes are allowed to close. And you do not need to heal every piece of your professional grief before your body is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the mattress. The dark night accepts your uncoupled journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unanchored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical mind and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth as a living being is identical to your output, allowing your entire frame to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your modern responsibilities are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low gurgle of an unchanneled spring moving beneath the floorboards of a dark storage hut miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp perimeters and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every schedule is softly forgotten, Every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace in this boundless, unlit expanse. The very concept of a beginning or an ending loses its structural grip on your awareness, revealing that the true sanctuary of your spirit has never been confined by the narrow parameters of a human clock. We spend our lives building elaborate fortresses out of our titles and schedules, believing that if we do not constantly fortify the walls of our daily routines, the vastness of the world will simply swallow us whole. The intellect tells you that your safety is a product of your constant motion, a fragile prize that must be defended each day through an unyielding commitment to visible results and collective utility. But as you sink deeper into the unforced gravity of the late hours, you discover that the vast sky of your presence cannot be diminished by a season of quiet, nor can it be erased by the simple cessation of an old career. The waterwheel does not lose its identity when the river slows to a whisper. It simply rests in its own elemental nature, perfectly integrated with the dark stream that surrounds its timber, requiring no permission from the valley to remain exactly as it is. Your fundamental reality is like that hidden spring moving silently beneath the moss-covered floorboards, flowing effortlessly without the need for an artificial flume, a wooden gate, or a public ledger to validate its direction. The old anxieties about whether you have achieved enough, the hidden guilt of enjoying a blank calendar, and the somatic phantom pain of an absent responsibility are merely passing shadows on a granite floor that remains completely solid, cool, and undisturbed in its deepest foundations. The long decades you spent translating your vital energy into a machine of constant production have not compromised your internal ground by a single fraction, because the pure awareness that holds your heart has no quota that must be fulfilled, and no deadlines that can be broken by the simple arrival of your fatigue. When you allow the frantic habit of checking the mind for a new task to dissolve into the shadows of the room, you are not losing your orientation. You are finally permitting your soul to return to the unbroken baseline of its original freedom. A heart that is trapped in a state of continuous structural vigilance can only interpret an empty hour as an existential deficit, using the old mechanisms of internal shame to force a tired, changing life back into an outdated mold. By making the conscious, deliberate choice to step down from the stage of your old utility, for the remainder of this night, you are permitting your nervous system to fully absorb the cool, stabilizing moisture of the evening, letting the rigid boundaries of your past titles soften naturally at their own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to justify your existence to the darkness to deserve the absolute comfort of this bed, because your value as a living presence was already fully complete, long before you ever learned to measure your days by a collective standard of success. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that requires no intervention from your intellect, simply expanding and releasing within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention. The remaining tightness that was vibrating across your upper shoulders has completely lost its hold, dissolving like a handful of dry pine needles, settling into the deep loam of the forest floor, leaving your muscles feeling remarkably light, porous, and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future mornings before your eyes are allowed to close, and you do not need to heal every piece of your professional grief before your body is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the mattress. The dark night accepts your uncoupled journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unencored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical mind and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth as a living being is identical to your output, allowing your entire frame to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your modern responsibilities are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low gurgle of an unchanneled spring, moving beneath the stone steps of an empty garden, miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp perimeters and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every schedule is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally, beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace.